It was one of those sullen London mornings that seemed to carry a mist of secrets over the rooftops. I had just begun buttering a scone at 2 to 1B Baker Street, when Mrs. Hudson's voice floated up from the hallway below, announcing a visitor. Sherlock Holmes, lounging with a violin across his lap and an unread newspaper on his knees, didn't stir until she added, "Inspector Lestrade, sir." That, of course, brought Holmes instantly to life. The violin clattered onto the settee. As he rose, smoothing his dressing gown, "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson," he called, his lean frame now alert as a hound sensing a trail. Lestrade entered with his usual brusque manner, removing his hat and coat, but not his air of tension. He had a dossier tucked beneath his arm and worry whereupon across his brow. "You've come early," Holmes noted, already striding to the desk. "And you've brought trouble. Sit, man. Out with it." Lestrade dropped into the chair. "This one's beyond us, Holmes. It's got everyone at Scotland Yard scratching their heads." He opened the folder and pulled out a photograph of a woman in her late 40s, stern eyes, tight curls. Her name was Mrs. Annabel Greeley, widow, found dead 3 days ago in her Kensington home. Autopsy confirmed it massive cardiac arrest. No foul play. Funeral was yesterday afternoon. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "So why are you here?" Lestrade placed another photograph on the table. It was of the same woman. Same unmistakable features, except this one had been taken that very morning, in front of a florist on Fleet Street. She was alive. She attended her own funeral. Holmes. Two people swore it was her. One was her sister, the other her housekeeper of 15 years. Both say she even spoke to them. A silence fell between us, broken only by the low crackle of the fireplace. Holmes finally murmured, "Tell me about the body." Lestrade nodded, flipping open. A report, discovered by her maid, lying at the foot of the stairs. No signs of struggle. Dr. Atkinson confirmed it death by heart failure. The body was identified by the sister, Miss Louisa Greeley. They'd lived together for years. Holmes paced to the window, his silhouette sharp against the morning haze. Who prepared the body for burial? The local undertaker. No cremation standard. Intimate at St. Mary's. And the casket, sealed, of course. Closed ceremony. Her sister said she couldn't bear to see her again. Holmes turned sharply. Yet she swears she saw the woman alive today, spoke to her, gave her a white rose, and told her, "It's all been taken care of, Louisa. You're safe now." Then vanished. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Watson, coat. We're going to St. Mary's." The graveyard was bleak and empty, save for a groundskeeper with a shovel and the distant squawk of crows. Lestrade led the way to the fresh mound, the soil still damp. The headstone bore the name Annabel Greeley, beloved wife and sister, 1848 to 1895. Holmes knelt, studying the earth. "No signs of tampering," he said. "But it's only been a day." He stood, brushing off his knees. "Tell me, Lestrade, where does Miss Louisa Greeley live? Still at the Kensington house?" "I have a carriage waiting." Louisa Greeley received us with a face pale as bone china and eyes swollen from tears or fear. She clutched a handkerchief as Holmes paced slowly through the parlor, glancing at photographs and the faint indentation on the divan where someone had recently sat. "You are certain it was your sister?" Holmes asked gently. She smiled at me. "She called me Louis. No one else calls me that. Could it have been a woman who resembled her?" Louisa looked wounded. "No, it was her." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Then tell me, Miss Greeley, why was the funeral so hasty?" She hesitated, then looked at Lestrade. "Annabel was a private woman. We thought it better that way. Or someone wanted the body buried before certain things could be discovered." Holmes mused aloud. At that moment, the housekeeper entered with tea astern. Silent woman named Mrs. Blackwell. Holmes watched her pour, then said suddenly, "You were the second person to see the dead woman, yes?" She nodded curtly. "Did anything seem amiss?" "I'm not a doctor, sir, but you are observant." She met his gaze. "I found a rose petal on her wrist, white, and a smear of some kind of ink near her left ear. I mentioned it to Dr. Atkinson. He said it was nothing." Holmes turned to Lestrade. "I want that body exhumed immediately." But Holmes, immediately, 2 hours later, back at St. Mary's. The grave was opened under Holmes's watchful eye. The coffin emerged. The lid was unsealed, and Lestrade pried it open slowly. Inside lay a woman's body, but not Annabel Greeley's. The features were wrong, the chin too narrow, the nose unfamiliar. Holmes leaned closer and sniffed. "Formalin," he muttered. "Heavy, meant to mask decay. This body's been dead for weeks, possibly months." Lestrade stared. "Then who?" Holmes stood. "It wasn't her funeral. It was a switch." "But why fake your own death?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked to the gravestone, to the single white rose placed at its base. Later, that night, we sat once more in our sitting room. Holmes was examining the ink stain from a swab he'd taken at the Greeley home. "A certain type of ink," he said, "used only by notaries and legal clerks. Found on the corpse's ear, suggesting papers had been signed in her name after death." "You think Louisa forged something?" "Quite the opposite," Holmes replied. "Annabel faked her own death to protect her sister. She must have learned someone was plotting to harm Louisa, perhaps financially, perhaps worse. Swapping the body gave her time and invisibility. But the body, where did she get it? There's a missing persons report from a workhouse woman, last seen near Kensington, same build. No family, no inquiries. Someone like Mrs. Blackwell, with connections in the underbelly of London, could have arranged it." I frowned. Then, "What was the purpose of appearing at the florist?" "A signal," Holmes said, "to let her sister know the danger had passed. Whatever threat loomed, blackmail, coercion, Annabel dealt with it while presumed dead. And now she will vanish again," Holmes said, lighting his pipe. "Perhaps to France, perhaps to Scotland. She will never return, and no one will pursue her, not while Louisa Greeley has her sister back, if only in memory." We sat in silence for a while, until Holmes murmured, "The widow who attended her own funeral. Watson, a mystery worthy of Poe himself." I could not disagree. The next morning, Holmes stood by the fireplace with the newspaper open in one hand. and a half-burnt match in the other. He wasn't reading, merely staring through the columns, thinking. The shadows under his eyes betrayed. A sleepless night his mind had not let go of the widow who had come back from the grave. I poured him coffee. You believe she staged it all alone? Holmes blinked and folded the paper. No, Watson, that body was not obtained without help, nor was the timing swift burial, closed casket, and a false death certificate achievable without someone on the inside. He sipped slowly, then added, "There is more to uncover, and I believe we'll find it not in the cemetery, but in the Greeley house." An hour later, we returned to the Kensington residence, only to be met with reluctant eyes and stiff greetings. Miss Louisa Greeley looked haggard. It was clear that last night's discovery had rattled her deeply. "I've had no word from her," she said. "If you know where she is, please." "I do not," Holmes replied gently, "but I do believe." She left behind more than a whisper. He turned to the housekeeper. "Mrs. Blackwell, would you kindly show me to Mrs. Greeley's study?" "That room hasn't been touched since she passed," Louisa interrupted. "Precisely why it may prove useful," Holmes said, already halfway up the stairs. The study was modest, but immaculate books lined the walls, and a single desk stood under the window, papers stacked neatly atop it. Holmes drifted toward a display cabinet and tapped the glass. Inside were old letters, dried flowers, and a faded military medal. She kept her husband's belongings. Holmes said softly, "That suggests loyalty." Yet she vanished without telling her sister. The contradiction is curious. He circled to the desk, running a fingertip along the wood until it paused at a blot of ink. Holmes leaned down and sniffed. "Still wet, Watson. Someone's used this desk recently." I frowned. "But no one's touched the room since her death." Holmes nodded. "Which means someone came here after she died. Or perhaps she never left." He opened the drawer and found correspondence, mostly unremarkable utility bills. Letters from church charities, but one caught his eye. It was a small envelope, hand-addressed, with no stamp or seal. The paper was unusually thick, and when Holmes opened it, 2 items slipped out upon receipt from a jeweler in Islington and a folded piece of music sheet. A pond brooch, he read, worth barely a few shillings. Unremarkable, unless this was staged to hide a visit, a false errand. He turned over the music sheet. A small X was drawn in pencil at the corner of a measure, beside a D sharp that had no reason to be marked. Holmes squinted. "Watson, look at this key signature. I don't see anything unusual." "Exactly. It's a cipher. No competent musician would mark this note. It's common. But look at the staves. Count them." I leaned closer. 7. Holmes nodded. A musical cipher. Letters mapped to notes. This X, it's the 7th. D sharp. In the key of B minor. That tells us something else. This was never meant to be played. He pocketed the sheet and looked around once more before tapping the back of the bookshelf. It sounded hollow. I'd wager a bottle of claret. There's a false panel here. With a bit of pressure, a slim panel gave way, revealing a small compartment. Inside were several documents, tightly bound with twine. And something else on item that made Holmes pause. A tiny porcelain bird, its wings painted gold. He turned it in his fingers, then looked to Mrs. Blackwell, who had lingered in the hallway. This birdie doesn't match the room. It's a Bavarian piece, pre-war. I've seen it before. In the window of Trammer's curio shop on Fleet Street. Louisa looked confused. That's quite specific. I remember it, Holmes said. Because it was not for sale. It was a signal item, one that changes position in the window every Thursday. For what purpose? I asked. Holmes smiled darkly. To let a certain clientele know that Trammer is open for discreet exchanges, documents, favors, identities. Louisa paled. Are you saying Annabel was involved in criminal dealings? Not directly, Holmes said. But she may have borrowed help from someone who is. Someone with access to a cold corpse, a false certificate, and the ability to vanish. Holmes turned to Mrs. Blackwell. Tell me, madam, who brought in the undertaker? I did. She said flatly. Did Mrs. Greeley ever go out without informing the household? Never. She answered too quickly. Holmes leaned in slightly. You lied about the rose petal. I found no mention of it in the doctor's report. You planted that idea to suggest sentiment, grief, but you overlooked the ink. That wasn't cosmetic, it was the kind used by an attorney. I believe you've seen Mrs. Greeley since her death, possibly helped her escape. She stiffened. But Holmes pressed on. You've worked for the family for 15 years. Loyalty doesn't vanish overnight. You weren't protecting Annabel, you were protecting Louisa. Tell me what you know, and you'll face no charges. The housekeeper's jaw trembled. Her fingers tightened around the folds of her apron. Then she said, almost inaudibly, she was being threatened. Louisa gasped. What? Mrs. Blackwell continued. A man. He came by 3 times in a month. Said he had letters damning ones. Claimed your sister had forged bank drafts after her husband's death. He wanted money. Blackmail, Holmes said, eyes gleaming. She didn't have much, but she had connections. Old ones. Dangerous ones. She said, if I disappear, he'll leave Louis alone. Louisa was crying now. She never told me. She left instructions. Told me to bring in the body she'd arranged and contact a solicitor, someone named Merrick. I never saw her again. Holmes's fingers tapped his knee thoughtfully. Merrick. Yes, a known alias handler. She paid for a new identity and vanished. But who was the man threatening her? I asked. That, Watson, is our next step, Holmes said, eyes narrowing. And if I'm correct, he'll be watching this house still. Because he doesn't believe she's truly dead. He moved to the window and drew the curtain just a hair across the street. A man in a long grey coat leaned against a gas lamp, pretending to read a newspaper. But the paper hadn't turned in 20 minutes. His eyes flicked now and then toward the front door. Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. And there's our keen observer, Watson, watching the widow's home, not knowing she's already slipped from his grasp. Holmes remained at the curtain for another minute, eyes trained on the man beneath the gas lamp. We'll draw him out, he said finally. But not yet. He doesn't know we've seen him." He turned back to Mrs. Blackwell, whose hands were now trembling as they twisted her apron. "You've told us part of the truth. Now I need all of it. You said the man came 3 times. What did he look like? Tall, sharp chin, grey eyes. The sort who doesn't smile unless it's for cruelty," she said, voice tight with memory. "He said he used to be in business with Mr. Greeley before the accident." Holmes looked to Louisa. "What accident?" "My brother-in-law died in a rail yard explosion. Everyone said it was faulty piping. He was a foreman then," she said. "But Hannibal always believed someone tampered with the pressure gauges." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Did she say who?" "She suspected someone named Edwin Pike. He'd gone bankrupt that year, blamed my brother-in-law for refusing him an extension on payment. But nothing was ever proved." Holmes's face darkened slightly. "Pike. That name does ring a bell." He motioned to Lestrade, who had joined us from the carriage after receiving a quick note. "Have Pike brought in," Holmes instructed, quietly. "I want him in a room before he realizes anything's amiss." Lestrade nodded and left. Meanwhile, Holmes requested Mrs. Blackwell remain in the drawing room and had Louisa escorted upstairs for rest. Then he turned to me. "We're going to Trammer's curio shop. We found it nestled between 2 shuttered storefronts off Fleet Street. Its window full of gaudy trinkets and porcelain creatures. The gold-winged bird was gone." The bell above the door gave a soft chime as we entered. A bent man emerged from behind a velvet curtain, his eyes sharp despite his years. "Mr. Trammer?" Holmes asked. "If you're buying, yes. If you're asking, it depends who's asking." Holmes didn't bother with pretense. "I'm Sherlock Holmes, and I believe you've been helping a woman by the name of Hannibal Greeley." Trammer's expression flickered. "Can't say I know the name." Holmes plucked the porcelain bird from his pocket. "Then perhaps you know this." Trammer sighed, wiped his hands on his vest. "She came a month ago," said she. "Needed to disappear. Paid in sovereigns. Said if anyone came asking, I was to say nothing. She never gave her name, but I'm no fool." "What did she ask you to do?" "Put her in touch with Merrick." "I did. After that, she only returned once to drop this off." He gestured to a small parcel behind the counter. "Said someone might come looking for it. If it was a man with grey eyes, I was to burn it." Holmes leaned forward. "It's that man I'm looking for." Trammer gave a raspy chuckle. "Then you can have it." Holmes opened the package with care. Inside was a folded letter, and tucked within, a photograph of 3 men at a factory yard. One of them was Edwin Pike. She kept this. Holmes murmured, examining the back. In Hannibal's sharp handwriting. "The last day he smiled after it blew, the others died." He tucked the photo into his pocket. "Trammer, if this man with grey eyes returns, delay him. Tell him the package was taken. Then lock your door." Back at Baker Street, Lestrade arrived with Edwin Pike in tow. Pike looked the part, well-dressed, confident, but with that sheen of desperation Holmes often noted in the truly dangerous Mr. Pike. Holmes said smoothly, "How did you know Mrs. Greeley?" "I didn't." Pike replied too quickly. "Strange. You're in a photo with her husband." The day of the explosion at the rail yard. Pike stiffened slightly. We worked together. That's all. Holmes leaned in, folding his hands. You visited the Greeley home 3 times. I have witnesses. You were pressuring Mrs. Greeley. Why? Pike's jaw twitched. You've got nothing to prove that. I don't need to prove it, Mr. Pike. You've already done that for me. Holmes pulled out the letter. Mrs. Greeley said you smiled after the blast. She believed you caused it. Then you'd returned years later with forged letters implicating her in fraud. Pike's expression didn't crack, but the silence thickened. She was never afraid for herself. Was she? Holmes went on. You threatened her sister. You said if she didn't pay, you'd go to the papers with forged evidence, destroy Louisa's name. That's conjecture, Pike hissed. But it's also motive, Holmes replied. You wanted money and revenge. You knew Annabel was tough, so you targeted what she loved. You underestimated her. She vanished, faked her death, and now you've been caught loitering outside her home. Care to explain that? I was curious, Pike said with a thin smile. Curious if she'd rise from the grave. Holmes stood. You'll be arrested on suspicion of extortion. Scotland Yard will be tearing through your records within the hour. Lestrade cuffed him silently and led him out. Holmes turned to me after they'd gone. He was prepared for every possibility except the one where a dead woman outmaneuvered him. But why didn't she just go to the police? I asked. Holmes paused. Because some truths are never clean. She may have indeed forged those documents years ago to save the house or Louisa. Enough guilt to silence her, but not enough to let a blackmailer destroy her sister. That evening, we returned once more to the Greeley home. Mrs. Blackwell met us with wary eyes, but Holmes held out the photograph. She left this for you. Louisa appeared behind her, eyes wide as she saw the image. She said he smiled after it blew. Holmes said softly, she was right to be afraid, but she was braver than you knew. Louisa took the photograph with trembling hands. She's not coming back, is she? Holmes shook his head. No, but she won't be hunted anymore. And you're safe. That night, as fog curled once more through the streets of London, Holmes stood by the fire with a pipe in hand and silence. On his lips, she watched her own funeral. I said, face the man who killed her husband, and vanished, leaving justice in her wake. Holmes nodded. Sometimes, Watson, the finest detective is grief itself. It sees what we cannot, and acts while others hesitate. The embers in the hearth crackled quietly as Holmes sat in his armchair, pipe unlit in his hand. Eyes narrowed in thought. I had grown used to his silences, but this one felt denser than most, less like a pause, and more like the hush before. The final turn in a chess match. Something still doesn't settle, he said abruptly, rising to pace. We have Pike in custody, the threat neutralized. And yet I cannot shake the feeling that we've seen only a corner of this canvas. Something remains obscured. I looked up from my notes. You think someone else was involved? Holmes didn't answer at once. He moved to his desk and retrieved the folded cipher from the music sheet Annabel had hidden in the false panel. This was not left behind carelessly. She wanted it found. But why encode anything at all unless she feared someone close might discover it? He flattened the page against the table and tapped the corner where the faint X had been marked. She was afraid. Yes, but of what? Pike's threats. Yes, but perhaps also of something or someone she never named. Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes opened it with a flick. From Lestrade, he muttered. Pike refuses to speak further, claims he has nothing to lose. But they found a second set of documents in his flat. Drafts of letters, he said, were from Annabel. Though the handwriting's a poor match, I leaned in. So he forged the letters to blackmail her, undoubtedly. But what's strange is the dates on the drafts, Holmes said, turning the sheet to show me. The earliest is dated 6 months before he approached her, which means he'd been preparing this long before he ever made contact. Planning? Holmes nodded, or waiting, and that implies foreknowledge. He must have known something would make her vulnerable against something he couldn't act on. Until the right moment. He lit his pipe now, as if the rhythm of smoke might draw the pieces together. Watson, do you recall the detail Mrs. Blackwell let slip that Annabel pawned a brooch before vanishing? Yes, but it seemed insignificant. Only if we assume desperation. But what if she did it too? Fund something specific? A payment? Or a bribe? I blinked. You think she paid someone off? Holmes smiled without mirth. Or bought silence. Come, we're going back to the pawn shop. There's one more thread we haven't tugged. The shopkeeper at the Islington establishment recognized us immediately. The brooch? Yes, I remember it. Tiny thing. Blue stones. She said it was a family piece. Didn't seem eager to part with it. Did she mention why she needed the money? Holmes asked. The man shrugged. Said it was to cover burial fees. Odd thing to say. Looking so healthy. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Did she say who the burial was for? Her sister. I think, though she corrected herself and said it was a friend. We stepped outside, Holmes moving quickly. Now, she used the money to arrange her own death, the paperwork, the stand-in body. She was already planning the vanishing act before Pike ever made contact. Which means something else drove her to it. He stopped short. There's only one person left who knew her closely enough to guess her moves, who might have reason to fear the truth coming out. I followed his gaze. Louisa. He said nothing, but the tightness in his jaw told me enough. We returned to Kensington just past sunset. Louisa met us at the door, visibly shaken. Is it Pike? Did he confess? Holmes didn't answer directly. I need you to help me understand something, Miss Greeley. The night your sister vanished. Who last saw her? She blinked. I don't know. I was asleep. Mrs. Blackwell said she checked in after dinner, but I didn't speak to her that evening. Interesting, Holmes said. Because your sister told Mrs. Blackwell to deliver the forged documents to a solicitor, but she never delivered them. She left them hidden in the wall. Louisa's brow furrowed. So why hide them if the threat was imminent? Because she didn't intend to go through with the plan unless she had to. She kept them sealed, as insurance. She feared Pike, but not as much as she feared betrayal. Louisa's voice cracked. "What are you suggesting?" Holmes stepped closer, eyes unreadable. "Your sister loved you more than her own name. She'd disappear for you, but she would never leave unless she believed it was the only way to protect you." Louisa backed away. "No, I didn't ask her to do anything. Of course not," Holmes said quietly. "But did you tell her the truth? That you were already in debt? That you'd borrowed money from someone who demanded repayment? You couldn't manage?" Her breath caught. Double quotes. "Yes, Miss Greeley. I found the bank slips in your writing, not hers. You signed for loans under her name. You assumed her identity more than once to delay foreclosure. And she found out." Louisa collapsed into the chair behind her. "She was going to report me." "No," Holmes said gently. "She was going to save you. But then Pike appeared, and you saw your way out. If she vanished, the debts died with her. You could start anew. You said nothing when she made her plan. Perhaps even helped her." Louisa stared at him with glistening eyes. "You think I wanted her dead?" "I think," Holmes replied, "you saw her disappearance as a solution. You never questioned where the body came from, never tried to stop her. You let her take the fall. And then you grieved publicly while quietly planning how to erase the debt with her gone." Tears ran down her cheeks now. "I thought she'd come back. She promised she would. She intended to," Holmes said. "But then Pike threatened you, and she knew it was no longer safe. He paced once. Annabel was no criminal. But the people round her twisted her love into leverage. Your deception, Pike's extortion, even Mrs. Blackwell's silence, all tangled motives, overlapping until the truth blurred." "What happens now?" Louisa whispered. "That depends on Annabel," Holmes replied. "If she chooses to return, she'll need to face what's left of this. If not, then the world will believe she's dead. And perhaps she will be, in all but name." Later, as we sat once more in our flat, Holmes tapped ash from his pipe. "It was never about a murder, Watson. It was about a woman who tried to bury her life to save another. And the others, Pike will hang for extortion and fraud. Louisa will likely be spared prison, though I imagine her guilt will imprison her longer than any cell." I looked out into the London mist, and the widow who attended her own funeral. Holmes's gaze followed mine. "She left behind the life that broke her," he said. "Perhaps she's earned the right to build another." The following morning, sunlight filtered reluctantly through the grey London sky, casting pale bars across the carpet in our sitting room. Holmes stood by the window, silent, his lean frame motionless except for the steady rise and fall of his breath. I was halfway through my second cup of tea when a knock came at the door. Urgent. Official. It was Lestrade. "They've found her," he announced, breathless from the stairs. "Annabel Greeley, alive." I froze, cup in hand. Holmes didn't turn. "Where?" he asked. "In a boarding house in Croydon, using the name Martha Kettering. A neighbor grew suspicious, said she looked like the woman in the obituaries. Police brought her. In just an hour ago, she confessed." "To what?" Holmes asked, his tone unreadable. Lestrade puffed up slightly. "Proud. To everything. Faking her death, hiding the body of an unknown woman to pass as hers, and leaving the scene to escape her debts and legal pressure. Claims it was all her idea, says she acted alone. Holmes turned now, slowly. And you believe her? Lestrade blinked. Well, the facts line up. She had the paperwork, the false death certificate, and even the undertaker Merrick admitted to helping her stage it. Said he was paid in silver sovereigns to remain quiet. What more is there? Much. Holmes said simply, if you care to see it. I sat forward. She's denying Pike's involvement, denied knowing him at all. Lestrade confirmed, said she picked his name out of thin air when she saw him watching the house. Just to throw off suspicion, said she. Never feared him. Holmes's eyes narrowed, not with surprise but confirmation. She's lying, he said flatly. To protect someone, Lestrade scowled. Why would she? Pike's already in custody. Holmes paced to the fireplace, his hand absently brushing the mantelpiece. Because she's still afraid of what Pike hinted at before, something darker, perhaps not yet revealed. She may believe someone else is still watching, someone she fears more than even exposure. Lestrade frowned. But she's safe now. She's been found. Holmes gave a humorless chuckle. That is the illusion of safety, Lestrade. The truth, however, remains at large. Moments later, we were in a hired cab to Croydon. Holmes sat quiet, but his gaze flicked restlessly. Something gnawed at him. She confessed to cleanly. He said suddenly, it's never that clean. Every criminal who builds a deception this elaborate grows tangled in their own contradictions. But Annabel, her story is polished, which means, I said slowly, she had time to rehearse it. Exactly. Holmes nodded. She was waiting to be found, or rather she knew she would be. When we arrived at the precinct, Annabel was seated in a plain wooden chair behind an iron desk. A shawl draped over her shoulders. She looked thinner, older, but her eyes were no less sharp than the last time we saw them through a curtains. Edge, Mr. Holmes, she said with a faint, tired smile. I suppose I should thank you. I imagine you've rehearsed what you'd say if I walked in. She didn't blink. Would it matter? He sat across from her, fingers steepled. Why confess now? After all this time, why let the veil drop? Because it was time, she said. Because Pike's gone and the rest doesn't matter anymore. But Pike is not your greatest threat, Holmes said quietly. Is he? She flinched just slightly. But it was enough. You left those clues deliberately. The porcelain bird, the cipher, a trail, but one that looped endlessly. You wanted someone to find you, but not the police. Someone specific. Who? She said nothing. Holmes leaned in, voice low. You were not hiding from Pike. You were hiding from someone Pike was working for. Who? Still she stayed silent. Holmes turned to Lestrade. She's not confessing. She's covering. Lestrade frowned. But the undertaker, the papers, Holmes raised a hand. All planted. Pike's arrest forced her to act. She realized someone else might step in to finish what he started. Her only option was to surface control. The narrative. He turned back to Annabel. You're protecting someone close. Someone who knows about your husband's death. Someone who's profited by keeping you silent. Her eyes flicked away. You don't know what you're talking about. Holmes softened his tone. You once trusted someone. They used that trust to silence you, to threaten your sister. You never expected Pike to take it so far, but he did. And now that he's gone, you still fear what that person might do. Her hands curled tightly in her lap. I can protect you, Holmes said, but not if you continue to protect them. She looked up then, eyes red but defiant. You think I'm protecting someone? You're wrong. I'm protecting what's left of my life. What they haven't stolen. Holmes stood. Then let's hope it's not stolen entirely. We left the room, and Lestrade followed. Clearly troubled. If she won't name names, we can't keep Pike on more than fraud. If she doesn't admit to his role, the blackmail falls apart. She won't name them, Holmes said grimly, because they're not finished. She sees herself as a decoy now. She'll take the blame to draw them out. Lestrade exhaled. So what do we do? Holmes's gaze was distant. We wait. She's lit a fire in the open and someone, somewhere, is going to feel the heat. As we rode back to Baker Street, I could sense the tension in Holmes like a storm gathering in dry wind. He wasn't speaking, not yet, because some part of the puzzle remained unturned. The confession, the arrest, the resolution it had all happened too easily. We're not done, he said quietly at last. Someone is still watching, still waiting. And as London's fog rolled once more through the alleys and lamplight shimmered on the cobblestones, it was clear the widow's funeral had been a beginning, not an end. The real criminal had yet to speak, and Holmes was already listening. Holmes did not sleep that night. As I dozed off in the armchair, the last thing I saw was his tall figure bent over the low table, where he had spread out every scrap of information, the cipher fragment, the undertaker's payment ledger, sketches of the crime scene, and a yellowed envelope bearing the faded seal of a defunct shipping company. I awoke near dawn to find him in the same position. But his eyes were sharp with a focused glint I hadn't seen since the Irene Adler affair. There's something we missed, he said before I could speak. Something old, something forgotten. He stood, brushing ash from his coat sleeve. The shipping company, L&G Maritime Freight. I blinked, still shaking off sleep. What of it? On a whim, I cross-referenced the name from the seal found in the funeral home drawer, an envelope marked with L and G, which Lestrade dismissed as irrelevant. That company ceased operation in 1889, nearly 8 years ago, after being implicated in a smuggling scandal. What sort of smuggling? Diamonds from the Cape Colony. And the co-owner of the company, one Lucius Greaves, disappeared shortly after the scandal, officially presumed drowned. But according to a shipping manifest I uncovered in the Times archive, Lucius Greaves arrived in London weeks later under an assumed name, which was Charles Greeley. I stood, heart thudding. Annibal's husband? Holmes nodded gravely. He changed his identity, married a young seamstress named Annabel, and began a new life. No one connected the dots because the scandal had already faded from public memory, and Pike, Was once employed by L&G as a shipping enforcer. His name appears on several manifests. Likely helped Greaves vanish and assumed he'd be repaid for his silence. Instead, Greaves tried to sever ties, so Pike re-emerged years later, with knowledge Hannibal may never have had. But then Greaves dies, and Pike shows up, threatening. The widow, precisely, but it goes deeper. I now believe Charles Greeley, formerly Lucius Greaves, was murdered not for his past, but for what he kept from it. A missing diamond ledger, the record of every illegal shipment, every buyer, every bribe. And that ledger, I murmured, could ruin anyone connected to it. Holmes nodded. Anyone still in power? He threw on his coat. Come, Watson, we're going back to the funeral home. Merrick's business was quiet when we arrived. The undertaker, now pale and guarded after his brief detainment, eyed Holmes with thinly veiled anxiety. Holmes didn't waste time. There was a safe behind the ledger shelf in your office, was there not? He asked flatly. Merrick hesitated. Aye, there was, but it's empty. Holmes stepped past him, walking into the back room. With a few brisk motions, he cleared the books and papers, revealing a square indentation behind the plaster. He turned, gesturing. Open it. Merrick shook his head. I gave the contents to the police. No. Holmes replied. You gave them the staged documents Hannibal supplied. But the real contents, what Pike came looking for, you kept. For leverage. Merrick's hands trembled. You don't understand. Holmes closed the distance in a heartbeat. I understand you were once a clerk for L&G before taking on this respectable trade. You knew Greaves' secret identity. You kept his secrets for years until Pike surfaced and threatened everything. Then you panicked. You helped fake Hannibal's death, hoping it would flush Pike into the open. But now you're sitting on evidence that ties half the city's financiers to smuggling and bribery. Merrick sagged against the doorframe. It's in the cellar, wrapped in oilcloth. I didn't know what to do. Minutes later, we stood before a dust-caked chest beneath the mortuary floorboards. Holmes opened it carefully, revealing a slim leather-bound book. Pages crackling with age and ink. Names, dates, shipments. Some entries were marked with symbols, diamonds, blades, initials in cipher. Holmes flipped through them rapidly. Lord Halberton, Sir Cedric Langdon, even a constable in Southwark. This ledger's not merely a record, it's a death sentence to anyone named. And Hannibal? I asked quietly. Did she know? Only fragments. She knew Charles was hiding something. She may have even glimpsed this book. But I doubt she ever understood its reach. When Pike began using it to threaten her, she saw no choice but to disappear. A slow dread settled in my stomach. So, who killed Greeley? Pike? Holmes shook his head. No, Pike was blackmailing the widow, not the husband. The man who killed Charles Greeley had nothing to gain by threats. He wanted silence, permanent silence. He paused, fingers tapping. The edge of the book. Merrick, he said suddenly, when you helped move the body. Where was it discovered? In the bath, Merrick replied, cautious, positioned as though he'd drowned. Yes. But there was no water. It was staged. Holmes nodded grimly. We're looking for someone who knew Greeley's habits, his schedule, someone who could gain entry without suspicion. His eyes turned toward the ledger. Langdon, he murmured. Sir Cedric Langdon, former business partner of Greaves before the scandal, not prosecuted. Later invested in Greaves' textile firm under the table. Likely used the widow's funds to continue their laundering under new names. I swallowed. He has motive and the means. And he's on the board of directors at one of the banks listed on every third page in this ledger. Holmes added, if Greaves had threatened to expose him or withdraw, Langdon wouldn't hesitate. As we left Merrick's ledger secured in Holmes's satchel, the fog outside had begun to thin. Morning was rising over London, but something darker still loomed beneath its surface. Holmes's expression was unreadable. The past, Watson, is a shadow, he said quietly, and no matter how far we walk forward, it finds a way to follow. As the morning haze lifted, and sunlight spilled across the damp cobbles of Baker Street, Holmes sat motionless at the table, his fingers steepled, his gaze fixed on the ledger. He had not spoken much since our return from the undertaker's. I had long since given up trying to distract him, knowing from experience that he was chasing the pattern behind the names, the shadow in the margins. He finally stirred, tapping a particular page lightly. There's something wrong here, Watson. Not with what's written, but with what isn't. He slid the book across to me. The page he indicated bore several entries from March 1889, listing transactions from a shell company named Thistle and Moore. Each one bore the initials C.G., clearly Charles Greeley's alias. Yet at the very bottom, next to the final entry, a space had been left conspicuously blank. Perhaps he forgot to complete it. Holmes shook his head. Greeley may have lied and laundered, but he was meticulous in his records. This blank isn't an omission, it's a message. He stood abruptly, pacing, the absence of an entry, surrounded by such incriminating evidence, implies one of two things. Either the individual was too dangerous to write down or too close. You think the killer's identity lies in what he chose not to record? Precisely. And that blank entry dated just 4 days before his death means Greeley had a final meeting. One he anticipated, but left undocumented. I leaned forward. So how do we flush them out? Holmes's eyes glittered. By inviting them back into the light. That evening, Holmes placed an anonymous advertisement in the Evening Standard, a cryptic note in the classifieds addressed to C.G.'s last visitor, stating that the ledger had surfaced and its contents would be reviewed by a third party at a secure location. A time and address were provided fictitious, of course. It was bait, pure and simple. And Holmes had a plan to watch the bait from the shadows. But that wasn't the unconventional tactic. That came the following morning. Rather than send Lestrade or some other visible watchman to observe the address, Holmes insisted on using an actor he had once employed in a case involving a forged will. Mr. Benedict Keene was a master of mimicry and nervous energy, and Holmes placed him in the role of a clerk who would pretend to handle the documents and receive the visitor. I need not catch the shark's teeth, Holmes said with a thin smile. I merely need to observe how it circles. At the designated hour, we took up post in an upper floor of the tobacconist's across the street, with a clear view of the modest office space Holmes had rented for the trap. A fire burned low in the hearth, and Keene sat stiffly at the desk, shuffling counterfeit ledgers meant to resemble the real one. We waited. For 15 minutes, nothing happened. Then, a carriage arrived, not the ostentatious type one would expect of a financier, but a simple, dusty black landau. The door opened, and out stepped Sir Cedric Langdon. Holmes didn't even flinch. He came himself. That's telling. Langdon entered the building, his posture upright, his movements controlled. Inside, Keene stood and greeted him with a practiced stammer. What we saw next was riveting. Langdon didn't speak at first. He simply glanced at the ledgers, then at Keene, then back at the ledgers. He reached into his coat, and I saw Holmes stiffen beside me, but instead of drawing a weapon, Langdon produced a white glove, and he began to test the ink on the page. By heavens, I whispered, he's checking if the entries are recent. Holmes nodded, smart, but too cautious. It means he suspects someone is trying to deceive him, and that Watson is a crack. Inside, Langdon made a decision. He dropped the glove, spoke briefly to Keene, who nodded, and handed him a card with a false solicitor's address, and left without touching anything else. Holmes was already halfway down the stairs when we intercepted Langdon at the end of the street. He was composed, but cold. "Mr. Holmes," he said, not bothering with pretense. "How amusing. I thought you were above petty traps." Holmes ignored the comment. "The real ledger is quite safe, but your reaction tells me everything I needed." Langdon narrowed his eyes. "You've no proof I killed anyone." "Not yet, but you were in Greeley's home the night he died. You left no record because you never intended your presence to be known. You were the blank in the book, Sir Cedric." The entry he feared most. Langdon's jaw tightened. "You're grasping. You insisted on meeting a low-level clerk in person. Why? Because you were terrified. Because someone who had that book could destroy you. So you took the risk." He stepped closer. "And when you entered the house that night, did he threaten you, say he would take the ledger to the papers? Or did he simply ask for more money?" Langdon said nothing. Holmes's voice softened. "You see, I know you didn't mean to kill him. You were frightened. You pushed too hard. He fell, perhaps hit the side of the bath, and you panicked. No knife, no blood, but enough to end a life." Langdon's breathing grew shallow. "Prove it." Holmes turned and gestured toward Baker Street. "We intend to. Back at our rooms." Holmes revealed the second part of his plan. Using Greeley's belongings retrieved from the funeral home, he had matched faint residues of tobacco ash found near the bath to Langdon's custom blend, a rare mixture imported from India, favored only by a handful of men in London. "There's your thread," he said. "One fiber on the bath mat, one speck on the floorboards. All you ever needed." "But the final blow?" I asked. "How will you compel him to confess?" Holmes's smile was slight and grim. "He already has. When he dropped that glove, he marked it with ink. We'll match it to the false ledgers, and that will place him there this very morning, seeking to silence the past." He looked out the window at the darkening sky. "It's always the quiet," tells Watson, a tremor in the voice, a pause before denial. "A man who forgets that the smallest gestures often betray the largest truths." The next morning dawned grey and tense, the kind of morning that presses its silence against the window panes. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent as he studied the glove now sealed in an envelope. Beside the ledger on the breakfast table, every thread of the case had begun to knot into a shape that almost made sense. But almost was never good enough for Holmes. The ash, the glove, Langdon's panicate all pointed in the right direction. And yet he stared at it with unease, his gaze unmoving. "I don't like the simplicity of it," he murmured, not touching his tea. "It is too clean, too cooperative. You think Langdon's playing along?" Holmes didn't answer, only turned and peered toward the window, as if expecting the street to shift and betray its secrets. He paced the room once, then opened the small safe beneath the floorboard, securing both the glove and the original ledger within. "Watson, I must leave you here for the day," he said, retrieving his coat. "I've an appointment at the Diogenes Club. Mycroft may possess correspondence or cables relevant to Langdon's international dealings. If this goes deeper than blackmail, we'll need to move quickly." Before I could protest, he was gone, coat swirling like a shadow behind the closing door. Left alone, I returned to my notes. My medical instincts had long given way to the thrill of deduction, and I busied myself cataloguing every nuance Holmes had observed. But as midday neared, I heard a knock at the door. But the rear entrance, it was Mrs. Hudson, pale and breathless. "Doctor, there's a man downstairs. He says it's urgent. A constable." Suspicion flared immediately. We had not summoned anyone from Scotland Yard. I descended to find a young constable in a muddied coat, cap askew. He held a sealed envelope. "From Inspector Lestrade," he said, panting. "Says you're to meet him at Bow Street immediately. A new witness has come forward about the Greeley matter." I frowned. Holmes is away. He didn't say anything of the sort. The constable shrugged. "Said it was urgent, sir. I'm just the messenger." I opened the envelope. It contained a brief note in Lestrade's scrawl. "Watson, come at once. We found something that changes everything. Bring the ledger." My blood chilled. Lestrade would never phrase it so crudely. He didn't know where the ledger was. Captain would never ask for it so plainly. "I'll fetch my coat," I said, excusing myself to the stairwell. Instead of returning, I rushed upstairs and opened the safe. To my horror, it was empty. The glove gone, the ledger gone. In their place, a small black coin lay flat, bearing an insignia I did not recognize, a warning, perhaps, a mark of intrusion. Holmes had only been gone an hour. I tore back downstairs, but the constable had vanished. "Mrs. Hudson," I said sharply, "did you see which way he went?" She was trembling. "He walked straight out, didn't even wait for a reply. Said he had other messages to deliver." My heart pounded. Whoever he was, he had never come for conversation. He had come for time, a decoy to distract me just long enough. When Holmes returned that evening, I met him at the door. The sharpness in his eyes turned immediately cold as I recounted what had happened. He said nothing at first, only entered and looked upon the empty safe like a surgeon discovering the heart already gone. "I should not have left it," he muttered. "I should not have trusted the silence." He examined the coin, turning it over in his gloved hand. "It's not currency. It's a marker, a token left only by one man I know, Sebastian Moran." "Moran?" I asked, stunned. "Moriarty's old lieutenant?" Holmes nodded grimly. "It seems the late Professor's web still trembles when disturbed." I felt the weight of the moment descend. "You think Langdon has ties to Moran?" "I think Langdon was merely the beginning. A valuable pawn, yes, but not the architect. Someone else knew the ledger existed. Someone feared what it contained enough to act swiftly and violently." He stepped toward the fire, tossing in the coin. "They want us to know they're watching. And now we have nothing. No glove, no ink trace, no ledger." But Holmes's gaze turned distant, calculating. "Unless—" He strode to the sideboard, where he had days before cleaned the glove of surface dust. "I tested the ink here, yes. I used the cloth, Watson. Fetch me the rag I used. It's still in the waste bin. I found it a crumpled strip of linen, smeared with faint purple traces." Holmes snatched it up with forceps, examined it beneath. The glass, still viable. "If the ink was genuine hand-mixed, as Langdon prefers, it will carry distinct chemical traits. The clerk at Wilkes and Holloway can reproduce them. We may yet recover the link." "But the ledger?" I asked. "Without it, we won't need the ledger," he said sharply. "Only to prove Langdon's presence, and now Moran's interference gives us the final thread." He stepped closer. "No one sends Sebastian Moran to do petty clean-up. They sent him to erase witnesses, which means someone else has the ledger and they fear it being decoded." A dark thought struck me. "And what of Langdon? If Moran is covering tracks, he may not stop at just the evidence." Holmes's face hardened. "Precisely. We must find Langdon before Moran does." But even as he said it, a sharp rap came at the front door, 3 quick knocks. Too deliberate to be casual, Mrs. Hudson opened it and staggered back with a gasp. A messenger stood there, ghostly pale, trembling. "They told me to give this to you," he said, extending a folded note to Holmes. "They said you'd understand." Holmes took it, unfolded it slowly. I read over his shoulder. "You can't protect him. You've already failed once." Holmes said nothing, but the fire behind his eyes now burned with a cold, vengeful clarity. "They've taken Langdon." The tension in Baker Street hung thick after the note's delivery. Holmes remained by the fire, the message clutched tightly in his hand, its corners already creased by the pressure of his grip. Outside, the wind scratched faintly against the windows, as though mimicking the unease now spreading through every breath we took. "They've taken Langdon," I said again, my voice barely above a whisper. Holmes didn't respond. He stared into the flames, jaw clenched, every muscle in his face drawn tight with calculation. Then, with sudden clarity, he turned and crossed the room to the desk, tearing open a drawer. "If they've taken him, it means Langdon knew something more. Then he realized, perhaps more than he should have. But he wasn't the one they feared. It was us. They left the coin not as a threat, Watson, but as a delay. He pulled a small vial from the drawer, uncorked it, and dabbed it onto the linen cloth he had used to clean the glove. The liquid turned the ink residue a deep green, and Holmes smiled grimly. This mixture contains manganese very few inks do. This will trace back to a single supplier. If we can find the person who sold it to Langdon or someone else, we may have a direction. At that moment, the bell above the door downstairs rang again. Mrs. Hudson called from the hallway, her voice uncertain. "There's someone here. To see you, a Miss Adela Greeley." We froze. Holmes looked up sharply, his brows knitting. "That's impossible." Moments later, the widow of the late Albert Greeley stood before us, alive. She was pale, her eyes darkened by something far beyond fatigue. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from restraint. "They told me I had to disappear," she said. "They faked my death to protect me. But now they've turned on Langdon, and I can't stay silent." I stared, speechless. "Miss Greeley, your coffin, your funeral, we saw it. You were identified." "It was staged," she said. "The body wasn't me. They needed me to vanish, so I couldn't contradict whatever story they planned to spin. But Langdon found out. He helped me escape. And then he hesitated. He started to see who was really behind this." Holmes nodded slowly, as if a great weight had shifted into place within his mind. "Moran." Her face paled. "You know him?" "I know his kind," Holmes replied. "And I know he wouldn't fake your death for your protection. He needed you gone to make a story airtight. You weren't a widow mourning your husband's betrayal. You were a witness to something far more damning." "What did you see?" Adela hesitated, then answered in a voice that chilled the room. "I saw Albert killed." Holmes stood utterly still. "You saw your husband murdered?" "Yes, by someone who wasn't supposed to be there. He came into our home wearing a constable's coat, carrying a box marked for evidence. Albert let him in. They talked like old colleagues. And then the man stabbed him. No warning. Cold, efficient. But before he did, he told Albert he should have left the ledger where it was. Did you recognize the man?" I asked. "No, but later, after I was hidden, I saw his face in a newspaper, behind a prominent politician, a shadow in the background. I never forgot it." Holmes's mind was now racing visibly. He crossed to the map on the wall and tapped a finger along the edge of London's East End. Langdon must have reached out to her. That means he found the truth and tried to double back. But someone in his own circle caught wind of it. Just then, the lamps flickered. A chill passed through the room, not from the air, but from instinct. Holmes stiffened. "Get away from the window." Too late. A sharp crack echoed from across the street. Glass exploded inward, and the lamp behind Holmes shattered with a flash. We dropped to the floor as a second shot tore through the wallpaper, where his head had been moments before. I pulled Adela behind the couch. Holmes crouched by the desk, his revolver already in hand. "A rifle," he said calmly, "long range. They've come to silence her." He pulled the curtain back slightly with the edge of a pen. Gone already. Moran never lingers. But this confirms that he's not acting alone. When the street calmed and a patrol was called, Holmes ushered Adela into the back room, placing her under Mrs. Hudson's care. He turned to me, urgency in his voice. "Watson, this isn't just about Greeley. This is a network. The ledger contained names, bribes, blackmails, perhaps even double agents. Langdon knew it, and now he's likely in one of their safe houses or worse." He grabbed his coat. "But they made a mistake. They tried to kill me in my own sitting room." That's a line even Moran shouldn't cross without approval, which means someone's grown desperate. I followed him out into the dark, lamplit streets of London. "Where to?" "To the docks," he said. "If they're moving Langdon or the ledger, it'll be by water, discreet, untraceable. And I know just the man who sells passage to devils." But as we reached the corner, a constable came rushing toward us, panic in his eyes. "Mr. Holmes, there's been a fire. Langdon's townhouse completely gone. They say no one escaped." Holmes froze mid-step. "Bodies not found yet. But we did find something in the alley, sir." He held out a torn scrap of paper, singed, half illegible. Holmes took it and turned it in the light. Scrawled in soot-black ink, in Langdon's hand. "They know about the widow. If I'm gone, protect her. She holds the real secret. Tell Holmes. St. James ledger not the original. Duplicate hidden. Seek." The rest was lost to flame. Holmes tucked the paper into his coat. "Langdon's not dead. Not yet. They want us to think he is. But now we have the one thing they feared we'd find. The woman who was never meant to speak." And then he added, almost to himself, "The game changes now." The rain had begun to fall with a steady rhythm by the time we reached the disused dockside warehouses at Shad Thames. The Thames itself, dark and heaving under the storm clouds, churned with silent menace, as if mirroring the secret trade that passed along its waters. Holmes walked ahead of me, his pace quick and deliberate. He had not spoken much since we left Baker Street, his mind consumed by the note Langdon's final plea and the impossible implications that came with it. Adela had been left in Inspector Lestrade's custody, under strict watch. Holmes had instructed him not to let her speak to anyone, no matter their uniform or rank. She was the linchpin, now the one truth the conspirators had failed to silence. And the note's cryptic reference to the St. James ledger duplicate had sparked something in Holmes's mind. He hadn't shared it fully with me, not yet. But his urgency told me that some long-buried connection had been unearthed. We arrived at the warehouse, the same rusted shell Holmes had once described as Moriarty's old smuggling nerve. The place was supposedly abandoned, but a faint trail of recent footprints in the mud suggested otherwise. Holmes studied them with a lantern, the flame flickering against the wet wood. "Fresh," he murmured, "and light-footed. Not Langdon. Likely a messenger or courier." We slipped inside, crouching low beneath rotted rafters and dangling chains. It smelled of salt, coal, and oil stale with the remnants of illicit movement. Then Holmes froze. A glint on the floor caught his eye, no larger than a coin. He picked it up, a copper cufflink, engraved with a faint fleur-d-list. I frowned. French nobility? No, Holmes said, inspecting the underside. The emblem of the St. James Club. Private, discreet, exclusive to government officials and their trusted associates. Someone has grown careless. They were here. We pressed forward until we came to a small chamber partitioned by a velvet curtain, its interior revealing a table strewn with documents. Holmes sifted through them quickly, ignoring most until he found a letter half buried beneath a ledger. His eyes gleamed. It was a shipping invoice listing crates delivered from a certain Greeley and Co. to the St. James Club and signed off by one J. Moran. Holmes inhaled sharply. It was never about the widow, not in the way we thought. Her husband was laundering documents through his business crafting forgeries, duplicates, phantom ledgers. But he wasn't doing it alone. Moran used Greeley's firm to filter counterfeit records into official archives, and Langdon must have found the original. That's what got him hunted. But why fake Adela's death? To tie up the last personal connection Greeley had. Make him a ghost, erase sympathy, turn a murder into a suicide, or a betrayal. But she saw the truth and hid it in her silence. Then Holmes paused. He leaned down again. There, embedded in the wax seal of the invoice, was a single red fiber, barely visible, except when the lantern's flame caught it at the right angle. Holmes plucked it free with tweezers and studied it under his lens, a theatre curtain. He muttered, "Velvet, dyed for the footlights. West End quality, perhaps." The Royal Lyceum. I raised a brow. The club operates above the Lyceum, doesn't it? Holmes nodded. Indeed. I believe we've misjudged our stage entirely. This was never about politics or espionage. It was theatre, a performance, meant to distract, to dazzle. But the slips, the cufflink, the fibre, the invoice reveal the puppeteer's shadow. And I believe I know who that is. Who? Holmes didn't answer. He was staring at the invoice again. At the date. "Watson," he said slowly, "do you recall when the glove first appeared?" "The one left on Greeley's body, of course." I said. "It was a woman's glove, monogrammed, but we believed it planted." "Yes, and that's what troubled me. A planted clue should serve a purpose. But this glove served none until now." He fished into his coat and retrieved the glove again, held it to the cufflink. "Look at the threading," he said. "Same copper stitching. That wasn't decorative. It was conductive." "For what?" "For a signal." And just like that, the pattern revealed itself. Holmes's mind moved faster than I could follow aloud. But I saw the dawning clarity on his face as he assembled it. Moran was running a coded system. Holmes said, "Gloves with copper threads worn by agents. Every time one of them entered a space or handled a ledger, a scanner embedded in certain locks or safes would recognize the threading. A security system primitive but brilliant. And it explains how the duplicate ledger was moved so fluidly." I blinked. So the glove wasn't just symbolic, it was the key. Precisely. And Greeley must have kept his version encoded. That's why only a copy stripped of the copper threading was ever found. The real one remains missing. Then where? Holmes turned sharply to me. eyes wide with a sudden, jarring realization. Adela, she wore the glove. But she doesn't remember she wouldn't, because it was sewn into her own garments, hidden. She's been carrying the last key all along without knowing it. We raced from the warehouse without another word, the rain slicing through our coats. Back at Baker Street, Adela was seated quietly, sipping tea with Lestrade watching her carefully. Her coat and old travelling cloak was folded neatly on the chair beside her. Holmes strode straight to it, fingers tracing the lining with surgical precision. Then, with a sound of satisfaction, he withdrew a single copper-threaded handkerchief sewn into the hem, attached by a seam so subtle even she hadn't noticed it. He held it to the glove and then to the cufflink. A perfect match. This, Holmes said, is the ledger's trigger, and the last part of the performance has yet to play. Lestrade stared, bewildered. What does this mean, Holmes? It means the true ledger was never written in ink. It was encoded in fibers passed from one textile to another, accessed only by one who had all three parts: the glove, the cufflink, and the handkerchief. And now that we do? I asked. Now, Holmes said, stepping to the window, we rewrite the ending. And across the street, for just a heartbeat, I thought I saw a figure watching us from the shadows before vanishing into the rain. Holmes remained at the window a moment longer, his silhouette backlit by the flickering gaslight of Baker Street. The figure across the road had vanished into the shadows, but its presence left a lingering tension in the room, like the final note of a discordant chord. He turned slowly and set the handkerchief on the table beside the glove and cuffling, three innocuous objects, now revealed as the triad key to a far-reaching conspiracy. Adela, pale but composed, sat still as Holmes addressed her. Mrs. Greeley, he said gently, do you remember any occasion in recent months when your husband insisted on tailoring your garments himself? She blinked, startled. Only once, just before he left on what he said would be his final trip to Brussels. He said the cloak needed mending and took it to his office. I thought it odd he usually left that sort of thing to our tailor, but he returned it the next day and said nothing else. Holmes nodded. He embedded the copper-threaded textile then. He must have known his days were numbered and wanted to ensure the truth would survive him. He trusted you, not to understand it immediately, but to endure long enough for the right eyes to see it. Lestrade, now leaning in over the objects, frowned. So what do we do with this lot? Will it unlock something? In a sense, Holmes replied, pulling a small pocket device from his coat. An early prototype by a colleague at the university in Lausanne. It responds to copper threading when passed over embedded wax seals, used in limited espionage circles. Let's see. He passed it over the glove first, and a small light pulsed on the device's surface. Then the handkerchief again, a pulse. But when he touched the cufflink, a sharp click sounded from within the device. Holmes quickly twisted its side, revealing a tiny slip of coiled vellum emerging from a hidden chamber. He unrolled it slowly and read in silence. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable, but his eyes had darkened. Well, I asked, feeling my heartbeat in my throat. He handed the vellum to me. I read it aloud. Ledger Code 17. reconciliation. Protocols, names Moran, Greeley, Mycroft Holmes. Operations reversals of state, Red Leaf Archive. Mirror Gate, Mycroft, I breathed. Your brother. Lestrade swore under his breath. Holmes sat down at last, folding his fingers before him. The silence pressing in. That, he said softly, is what this has all been about. The crime wasn't about eliminating a threat to national security or shielding a secret ledger. It was about severing the last thread of human connection in a life defined by deception. He leaned forward, the words now coming more steadily. Years ago, my brother was involved in a state-sanctioned reversal covert operation meant to dismantle a growing internal threat within British intelligence. But the men chosen to carry it out, Greeley, Langdon, Moran, each bore psychological scars. They became, in effect, pawns in a greater machine, used, discarded, and watched. He paused, except Greeley. He fell in love, and that was the mistake. Adela's eyes filled with tears, though she said nothing. Moran, Holmes continued, never forgave him for it. Not because of betrayal or exposure, but because Greeley found a way out. A life. Love was the weakness they couldn't allow. And so they orchestrated a burial first of his name, then of his wife. I stared at Holmes. The pieces finally aligning, so the motive wasn't treason or greed. No, he said, it was control. Psychological obedience. Moran believed the mission would always come first. That love, emotion. Family were threats to order when Greeley resisted. He had to be destroyed, but not just eliminated, made. An example. That's why Langdon was killed. He tried to help. That's why Adela was declared dead. Because if she lived, the illusion failed. Lestrade stood in stunned silence, then asked, and your brother, Mycroft, was he complicit? Holmes looked away. I believe he signed off on the program, but I do not believe he sanctioned this execution. Not the way it was done. That will be for him to answer. The room fell into stillness. Even the rain outside had softened to a whisper. Then, from outside, a sharp rap at the door. Lestrade moved to answer, but Holmes stopped him with a gesture. He walked to the door himself and opened it carefully. A woman stood there, soaked and trembling. I recognized her immediately. Margot Weatherby, the Royal Lyceum's assistant director. She looked as if she'd aged a decade. I saw him, she whispered. Moran, he's not done. Holmes ushered her inside, guiding her gently to the hearth. She held out a damp envelope, sealed with the same copper-inked fleur-de-lis. He sent this to the theater. No return address. But it's him, I know it. Holmes broke the seal and scanned the page. His face remained still, but something hardened behind his eyes. It's a warning, he said. What does it say? I asked. Holmes looked up slowly. He's inviting us to the St. James Club tonight. He calls it the final curtain. Adela gasped. Lestrade grabbed his coat. It's a trap. Holmes gave a faint smile. Of course it is. But it's also an answer. He's not hiding anymore. He wants us to see the final act, and we shall together. And with that, Holmes turned to the window once more, where the moon had just broken through the clouds, casting pale silver light across the rooftops of London. In that light, the story's cruel motive finally stood clear. It wasn't money or status that birthed the deception. It was a belief, a cold, devout belief that human attachment was the enemy of duty, and the man behind it all was ready to bring down the curtain on everyone. Night draped itself over London like a funeral shroud as we neared the St. James Club, its once grand columns now looming like silent sentinels above the glistening cobbles. Rain had returned, soft, cold, persistent beating on the windows and streaking down gas lamps. Holmes walked with quiet intensity, each step measured, his coat collar turned up, his cane tapping in rhythm with the drizzle. Beside him, Lestrade, and I flanked close, our pistols hidden, but ready. Adela remained behind at Baker Street under the watch of a trusted constable, though Holmes had left her with words not of comfort but resolve. If I fail, he had told her, trust Watson, and tell Mycroft everything. Now, as the three of us entered the marble foyer of the club, silence swallowed us whole. The porter was gone, the hall unlit save for the flicker of a single gas lamp swaying from a brass fixture. Holmes gave a faint, knowing glance and stepped forward, his hand brushing the velvet curtain that had once hidden clandestine meetings, and whispers exchanged behind cigars and brandy. Inside, the room had been transformed. The long table at the center was draped in crimson, and atop it lay objects arranged like offerings: the copper-threaded glove, a theatre mask, a half-burned letter, and a small revolver polished, loaded, and waiting. Opposite sat Colonel Sebastian Moran. He was dressed in black, his silver hair brushed neatly back, his hands resting on the table as if inviting debate rather than confrontation. The flickering light made him seem both alive and ghost-like, as though he hovered between worlds, hunter and hunted. Holmes did not flinch. He approached with the same quiet intensity he had carried all evening and stopped precisely 5 feet from the man. I expected theatre, he said, but I hadn't thought you'd light the stage yourself. Moran smiled thinly. It seemed fitting. We were always actors, weren't we, Holmes? You and I. We wore truth-like costumes and removed them when the job was done. You never understood truth, Holmes said. Only control. Is that what you think this was about? Holmes didn't answer. He gestured subtly, and Lestrade stepped around to the far end of the room, cutting off any retreat. I took the rear, eyes fixed on Moran's hands. Holmes continued, you orchestrated Greeley's death. You used Adela as a pawn, then buried her with lies. Langdon discovered your real purpose. He was silenced. And the ledger. It was never about finance. It was about conditioning, ensuring that men like Greeley never escaped the system. Once they saw through it, you make it sound so cruel, Moran said calmly. But what of Mycroft? What of your precious brother? Do you truly believe he didn't know? Holmes's face betrayed nothing. He knew of the operation, not of the betrayal. That was yours. Moran's smile faded. His hand shifted slightly toward the revolver, fingers resting gently on its wooden grip. Lestrade stiffened. I gripped my weapon tighter beneath my coat. But what I've never understood, Holmes went on. Was why you waited? You had everything arranged to Della's disappearance. The planted glove. The phantom ledger. Why leave hints? I left nothing. Moran said coldly. The glove was Greeley's farewell. He knew the moment he died that someone would follow the thread. But he didn't count on you, did he? No, Holmes said, eyes narrowing. But you did. A pause. Then something shifted in Moran's expression just slightly. A faint twitch at the edge of his mouth. You wanted me involved, Holmes said. You built the performance for me. Not because you feared me, but because you wanted an audience. One who could understand the architecture of what you built. Moran rose, slowly, deliberately. He didn't reach for the revolver. Instead, he stepped out from the table and faced Holmes fully. I wanted a witness, he said, not an audience. Someone who could see that what I did wasn't madness but sacrifice. Order is not born from sentiment, Holmes. It's born from discipline. And when men like Greeley begin to believe they deserve lives beyond duty, they threaten the very spine of this empire. You murdered a man for falling in love, I said. I removed a weak link, Moran snapped, and the woman, she would have drowned in the guilt. I spared her. Holmes moved, then not physically, but in tone. His voice turned icy. You spared no one. You simply failed to erase all the pieces. From his pocket, Holmes withdrew the slip of encoded vellum. This ledger, your ledger, contains more than just operations. It names the architects of Mirrorgate. It names you. And it names others who have no idea how close they came to ruin. You'll never prove it, Moran growled. Perhaps not in court, Holmes replied, stepping closer. But I don't need a courtroom. I only need the truth. And tonight, I brought it with me. At his signal, the door creaked open, and Mycroft Holmes entered. The elder Holmes was colder than his brother, less expressive, more calculating, but the look on his face as he took in Moran was not one of bureaucracy. It was one of betrayal. You went too far, Mycroft said. You broke protocol, and you broke lives. I completed the mission, Moran snapped. I finished what your cowardice refused to do. Mycroft stepped aside. Two officers entered. Weapons drawn. Moran laughed bitterly. You think you've won? No, Holmes said. You've already lost. In one final, sudden movement, Moran lunged not for the revolver, but for the theater mask on the table. He hurled it at the lamp, shattering the flame into a burst of fire. The room exploded with light and smoke. I dove forward as Holmes leapt across the table. Moran was fast. His age did not dull him. But Holmes was faster. He caught the man's arm mid-swing and drove him back against the marble pillar. Lestrade and I restrained him moments later, wrenching the hidden blade from his coat. Holmes didn't speak. He only stared, unblinking, into Moran's eyes. You could have vanished, he said quietly. You could have disappeared with your secrets, but you chose spectacle. That was your flaw. No, Moran hissed. It was my proof that none can escape what you are. And with that, he went silent. The officers dragged him away. Outside, the rain had stopped. We stood there, exhausted, as dawn crept over the horizon. Holmes said nothing as Mycroft stepped beside him, I'll see that it's buried quietly." Mycroft said. Holmes shook his head. "No, no more burial. Let the truth stand, for once." And with that, he walked into the light. The morning haze had just begun to lift over Baker Street when the doorbell rang a brisk, impatient ring that echoed through the house like a pistol shot. I had barely finished pouring Holmes his tea when he rose without a word and descended the stairs, his movement still taut with unease. The events of the previous night had concluded with Moran in custody, Mycroft's silent admission of complicity, and what seemed on the surface a definitive end to a twisting and brutal tale. But Holmes had not slept, not truly. His violin sat untouched. His pipe remained cold. Something, I knew, had burrowed under his skin. Something he could not yet name. At the door stood Inspector Lestrade, his face unusually pale. Without waiting for an invitation, he stepped in, clutching a small brown envelope, creased and damp with rain. "This came to Scotland Yard an hour ago," he said. "No return address, just my name on it." Holmes took the envelope, examined the adhesive edge, sniffed it, then peeled it open. Inside was a photograph, black and white, slightly blurred. It depicted the funeral scene from the week prior, the casket, the mourners, and among them, unmistakable, a second woman standing at the fringe of the crowd, wearing the same mourning veil as Adela. Holmes said nothing for several long seconds. Then he turned the photograph over, scrawled in looping handwriting, "You buried the wrong widow." "What does it mean?" Lestrade asked. But I already knew, or rather, I felt the sharp chill that came with the shape of the truth. Holmes walked slowly to the fireplace, turning the photograph over again and again in his hand. His jaw set hard. "She played her part too well," he murmured. "You mean Adela?" "No, Watson. I mean whoever pretended to be her." I stared. "But you spoke to her." "We both did. She knew things only Adela could know. She knew things a clever impostor could learn," Holmes said. "And I was too fixated on Moran's arrogance to see it." Lestrade blanched. "Then where's the real Adela?" Holmes's eyes flashed. "That, Inspector, is the last knot we must untie." Within the hour, we were back in Kensington, where the supposed Adela had been staying under protective watch. But the flat was empty. The constable stationed outside was gone, later found unconscious in an alleyway 2 streets over. Inside, the room had been cleared with meticulous precision. No photographs, no documents, not even dust. Holmes knelt by the window and touched a faint smear on the sill residue of adhesive tape. "She sealed something here," he said. "Perhaps a note, or perhaps something meant to look like one, from the drawer of the small writing desk." I retrieved a single item missed in the sweep, a pressed flower, a white chrysanthemum. Holmes took it with reverence, funereal and symbolic, a message, not a keepsake. He was quiet for a moment, then turned sharply to Lestrade. "We need the mortuary records. I want the autopsy of Greeley's body examined. Every mark, every scar, every sign of identity verified. I want certainty." But Greeley's body was identified by Adela. By someone, Holmes corrected, whoever she was. She wanted us to believe her. She manipulated Moran. Or she mirrored him, and she's not done yet. At Scotland Yard, the truth unravelled like a thread caught in a storm. The records showed that Greeley had indeed died of a gunshot wound to the chest, but the body had never been shown to the public. The viewing had been private arranged by the widow. There was no dental match, no fingerprints, just a locket found on the body, matching one Greeley had supposedly gifted. But that locket, it was still in Holmes's desk at Baker Street. He had taken it from Adela after her first visit. She claimed she no longer had use for it, and yet it had been used to identify a corpse. "I don't believe Greeley is dead," Holmes said quietly. Lestrade leaned back, stunned. But Moran, he confessed to the murder. Moran was arrogant, Holmes replied. But he was also played. He believed he had killed Greeley because he was meant to believe it. Someone staged the death, fed him false intel, or drugged Greeley, made the body appear lifeless, long enough for Moran to vanish and the switch to occur. But why would Greeley fake his own death? I asked. Holmes turned to the rain-dimmed window, his reflection ghostly against the glass. Because he saw something inside, Mirrorgate, and he realized the only way to escape it was to vanish, but he couldn't do it alone. So the woman, Lestrade, began. She helped him, Holmes finished, but not out of love, out of calculation. She needed him to vanish for her own plan. She used Moran's network, faked Adela's identity, and once the trap closed, she stepped into the widow's shoes to ensure the trail went cold. Lestrade whispered, "Then she's the real mastermind." Holmes nodded. "And now she has everything. The ledger, the knowledge, the freedom, and possibly Greeley himself." We stood in silence, the city humming outside like a wounded animal. Finally, I asked, "What do we do now?" Holmes turned, his eyes glittering not with defeat, but renewed purpose. "We find the chrysanthemum again," he said, "because, for someone that careful, that symbol was to deliberate. It's her signature, her vanity. She believes she's won, which means she's still watching." I swallowed. Watching who? Holmes didn't answer. He just looked toward the door and waited. The day Holmes had long anticipated came without ceremony. No telegram, no clue, no great stir in the underworld. Just the quiet, persistent knock at 2-to-1B's door, a rhythm too practiced to be mistaken for coincidence. When I opened it, the woman standing there was no longer clad in widow's weeds. She wore a simple grey coat, her hair unpinned, her eyes alert and unrepentant. Holmes didn't rise from his chair. He merely gestured toward the seat across from him, his gaze unreadable. "You came back," he said softly. She smiled. "I had to. You left the window open." He nodded once. "You've always liked to exit through unlocked places." I stood by the fireplace, my heart thudding, unsure whether to summon Lestrade or reach for the revolver in Holmes's drawer. But Holmes, calm as still water, didn't flinch. She studied him. "I could have run forever, changed my name. My face left England entirely. But something about your silence the past week bothered me. I had to know if I'd solved it." He asked, if you'd forgiven me." A quiet chuckle escaped Holmes, tinged with neither humor nor cruelty. "Forgiveness is irrelevant. I simply wanted the truth to stand up on its own legs. It does now." She glanced toward me, then back at him. "You've told them, I told no one. But I left breadcrumbs for those curious enough to look. You're here because you couldn't bear the ambiguity." She leaned back, something between admiration and regret shadowing her face. "I never meant to kill anyone." "You didn't," Holmes said. "Not directly. But you orchestrated the illusion that allowed Greeley's death to conceal his flight. You wore a mask and manipulated a killer into confessing to a murder that never happened. You made him believe in his guilt. You turned justice into theater." She looked away. "Greeley was already a ghost. The people he betrayed, the lives he destroyed. He didn't want redemption, just escape. And you helped him escape Mirror Gate," Holmes said, "by convincing the world that his body lay cold in a casket. It wasn't about love," she said, her voice thinner now. "It was revenge. He left me once, took everything. When he came back years later, shattered and afraid, I saw an opportunity. I could be the one to rescue him and bury him at the same time, and then step into the role of grieving widow." I said coldly, "Convince us of your sorrow. Assist the investigation. Ensure Morin's rest. I gave you everything you needed," she replied evenly. "The records, the dates, the motive. You gave us what you wanted us to see," Holmes corrected, "including the locket. She didn't deny it. You kept it. I knew you would." Holmes rose now, slowly, deliberately. "It was never about whether I would find out. It was whether you would let me." She smiled sadly. "So what now? Do you turn me in?" He stepped closer, folded arms resting behind his back. "To what end? Scotland Yard has Moran. Greeley, assuming he lives, is a ghost lost to the continent. You left no fingerprints, no documents. Only one photograph which you sent deliberately to test my reach. You created a puzzle too perfect to break with laws or bullets." She raised an eyebrow. "Then I've won." "No," Holmes replied. "You've escaped." And that subtle shift in language settled the matter between them like dust after a storm. Holmes stepped aside, allowing her to walk to the door. Her hand lingered on the knob. "You could have stopped me. I could have," he said. "But I wanted to see how the story ended." She opened the door, paused once, then left. It was hours before either of us spoke again. Holmes resumed his seat by the window, violin resting across his lap, untouched. "Finally," I said, "you let her go." "I let justice choose its own disguise," he answered. "She was a criminal, yes, but not the kind that rot behind bars. She weaponized grief, masked vengeance as sorrow, and turned truth into smoke. In a way, she beat us all. But you still solved it." He looked up at me. "What good is solving a ghost's murder if the world insists the ghost is dead?" I had no answer. The fire cracked softly behind us. Holmes picked up the flower I'd nearly forgotten. The white chrysanthemum and held it gently between thumb and forefinger. "There were clues," he murmured. "Always. The real Adela was right-handed. This one wore her wedding ring on the left only for show." Greeley's ledger was written in code, but some pages were newer, forged by a different hand. Moran confessed to easily an ambitious man doesn't crumble over a body he never verified. And the chrysanthemum, I waited, it blooms not. In grief, he said, but in rebirth, a symbol of second chances. I looked again at the delicate petals. You mean she always planned to come back? Holmes didn't answer. He didn't have to. Outside, a light drizzle painted the gaslight streets of London with a silver sheen, softening edges and smudging shadows. I followed Holmes as we walked wordlessly along Baker Street, our coats buttoned high against the chill. The silence between us was heavy, not uncomfortable, but contemplative, as though even the air hesitated to intrude on whatever conclusion Holmes had quietly drawn. "What will you tell Lestrade?" I finally asked. "That the case has resolved itself, as cases sometimes do when left long enough in the sun," Holmes replied. "And if he asks for details, he'll be too relieved to probe too deeply. With Moran in custody, the Yard has their headline. They rarely ask what lies beneath it." We turned the corner toward 221B. Holmes paused just short of the stairs and looked across the street. Eyes narrowed. There was nothing unusual: a closed tobacconist, a sleeping cab horse, a flickering lamp, but something in his gaze lingered. "You see something?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, like a man straining to recall the whisper of a half-forgotten melody. "She said she never meant to kill," he murmured. "Yes," I said, "but she helped Moran believe he had." "That's nearly the same." Holmes turned to me, brows faintly drawn. What if she didn't just help him believe? What if she was certain he would confess because she knew something we didn't? I frowned. "Such as she played us all masterfully," he said, voice low. "She wore grief like silk, fed us truth in carefully measured doses. But there's one thread she never explained." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small envelope, unmarked, save for a faint smudge of ash along the edge. "It arrived the morning after her visit," he said. "No return address, no name." Inside, he unfolded the flap and withdrew a single strip of paper. I took it from him. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the ink hastily applied. For words stared back, "Not who you think." The street seemed suddenly colder. "Another threat?" I asked. "Or a warning?" Holmes said. "Or perhaps a signature." We climbed the stairs in silence. Inside, the sitting room was warm, fire crackling merrily in the grate. But Holmes did not remove his coat. He stood by the window, one hand resting against the frame, the other holding the cryptic message as though weighing its true meaning. "Do you believe it?" I asked. "That the person we saw Della was someone else entirely? I believe. Nothing without evidence," Holmes said. "But deception layered this case like lacquer. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that someone was always one step ahead. Not Moran, not even Adela." He turned to me. "Tell me, Watson, what do you recall of the maid? The one who brought us the tea that first day at Mirrorgate?" I blinked. "Hardly anything. Brown hair, quiet. She left the room quickly. Too quickly," Holmes said. "She never once spoke to Adela. and when we returned the next day, she was gone, dismissed. The housekeeper said she had vanished during the night. You think she was involved? I think we were being observed, Holmes said, and not by Adela alone. The implications twisted in my stomach. Then the locket, the confession, even Greeley's disappearance may have been pieces on a larger board, Holmes finished. A game we didn't even realize we were playing. Outside, the rain intensified, striking the window pane in erratic bursts. Holmes drew the curtains closed and returned to the hearth. Lowering himself into his chair, he held the slip of paper up to the light again, then leaned forward and tossed it into the flames. The fire devoured it quickly, curling it to ash in seconds. Shouldn't we keep that? I asked. No, Holmes said. If it's genuine, they'll send another. If it's not, we're better off without the distraction. He picked up his violin and rested it beneath his chin, bow poised in his right hand. And if this isn't over? I asked quietly. It never is, Watson. Not truly. He drew the bow across the strings. The sound was low, aching a slow unraveling of tension, of thought, of quiet dread. The music filled the room like fog, and for a moment I imagined that somewhere out there in the night, another pair of eyes was watching, waiting. The fire popped gently. The rain softened. The tune Holmes played shifted, growing sharper, brighter, more deliberate. A transition, and I knew, without him saying a word, that the next case had already begun.